Hello and welcome to my channel In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne and today you get a bonus video because I have thoughts. I said in my video that went live earlier this week, hopefully, that I often have ideas for deep thoughts videos that I am not able to fit into my schedule because of other more time sensitive things or things that I am more interested in that I want to share, etc. But I do have a couple of deep thoughts topics that I really want to just get out of my mind, where they are ruminating and cogitating in there and off my chest, and share with whoever wants to hear them. So I'm going to do that today, and I figured it was a good idea to make it a bonus video. That way these topics that may or may not be of interest to a broader audience, it's okay. This is just extra content that I am putting out there into the world. Hopefully it is helpful to someone or interesting to someone. There's also a good chance that I am currently just avoiding doing all of the housework that needs to be done at this precise moment. So there's that too. Anyway, let's get on to the discussion. C.S. Lewis is famous for saying this quote: "Since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you are making their destiny not brighter, but darker." I want to talk today about the power that books and stories have in instructing us and guiding us and shaping us, not just academically and intellectually, not just in our worldview and in our understanding of things, but emotionally. I don't know that we really understand that the power that books have and other types of art have to help us become stronger emotionally as people. In particular, I think that there is a general tendency among people today to avoid anything that allows negative emotions to arise within us. By negative emotions, I mean sadness, I mean tension or stress, I mean anxiety, I mean fear. All of these are negative emotions, certainly, and none of them are pleasant to experience. And some people are more capable than others of processing these emotions and working through them. My contention, or my thesis statement, if you will, is that books and stories are a particularly powerful tool that helps us to be able to engage in these negative emotions and process them in a safe and helpful rather than harmful way that will allow us, when we experience these emotions in real life situations, to be able to handle them more efficiently and more purposefully and more effectively. I realize this is all sounding kind of like theoretical, right? And not practical. So let's bring it down to a little bit more practical of a level. And I'll talk about where I'm coming from with this idea. So some years ago, when I first started my training to be a Kodai music teacher, which I'm not going to take the time to go into what all that is, but it does involve using a lot of folk music. So in my training, we were learning a lot of folk songs and learning a lot of games and playing those games that we utilize to teach students musical concepts. And if you know anything about folk songs, you might think of like Mother Goose rhymes and stuff. And you might know about the one, for example, "Ring around the rosy, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down," which is supposed to be about the plagues that plagued Europe during medieval times and wiped out entire populations because they didn't have antibiotics or ways to deal with these sicknesses that would, and also because they had very unhygienic lifestyles many times. So these illnesses would just wipe out entire populations. And there's a song about it, a fun children's song where they all fall down dead at the end of the song. And what's more, they find it hilarious. So we tend to, with our modern eyes, look at that when we realize that with a little bit of horror. Like, they're singing about dying and falling down dead. And a discussion was raised during the course of our training about the high frequency of the mention of death and dying and sickness and other negative things in these folk songs, folk rhymes, folk games. And the leader of the class, the one who was teaching us, she made an excellent observation that kind of was a little bit of a paradigm shift for me and gave me some really great insight into raising my own children and also guiding my discussions and topics that were raised in my classroom as a result of these songs and the song choices. And she said that previous generations were very wise, much wiser than our own, because they understood that when children encounter these difficult things in the guise of something simple and safe and fun, like a game or a song or a story, then they are much better able to handle it when it happens in real life. What we want to avoid is the truth that, as C.S. Lewis says, it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies. Enemies of circumstance, enemies in person. Children will have difficulties in their life. We will have difficulties in our life. It is unavoidable. That's a truth we want to shrink from. We want to step away from all difficulty. We want to close our eyes to anything that is difficult to go through. We want to avoid any mention of hard things that make us sad, that make us fearful, that make us angry, that make us question. We want to avoid those negative emotions at all costs. But we can't. We are going to encounter them in real life sooner or later and regularly. It's not just going to be a one-time thing. There are going to be negative things that happen to us from one end of the spectrum to the other, from small minor inconveniences to great tragedies and trauma. They will happen. They will happen to us. They will happen to our children. And isn't it better to be prepared for those things in any way that we can be than to be thrust into them headlong without any prior practice in dealing with them? There was so much wisdom in that brief statement that she made about prior generations preparing their children for tragedy and trauma and trial. I really took it to heart. And the more I see and experience and observe, and the more I read, the more I see evidence of the truth of that statement. I have read that it is very helpful for children to experience the death of a pet, because that is it's like, I don't want to equate death with video games, so I'm not making like an equal comparison here. So I hope you understand that. It's just an analogy to help understand. When you go through a video game, generally speaking, there are levels, right? So, level 1 has some things that are tricky, but as you master those things, then you go to the next level, and then there are other things you have to master, and it gets harder and harder and harder. If you are dumped right in level 10, let's say Tetris, for example, if you are jumped right in level 10, when the pieces are flying at you, and you are flustered and you're stressed out and you don't know what to do and you can't think quickly enough because you don't have the practice to deal with it. You have to start at level 1 where the pieces come nice and slow and you have time to think about where you're going to put them and analyze and strategize. But then as the levels keep going and the more practice you have, how much easier it is to be able to put those pieces where they need to go as they come down rapidly. Well, life is like that. It's throwing pieces at you, right? So it's helpful for our children and for us too. It's helpful to have those practice levels where we can practice taking those pieces that life throws at us and putting them in their place and making sense and order out of our life and out of the things that happen to us to the best that we can. You know, not everything is going to line up neatly like a little Tetris, row of 4 lines. It's not always going to happen like that. But we have a much better chance of being able to process all of these things that life throws at us if we have practice. And so back to my topic of a child experiencing the death of a pet. That is like a practice in grieving. It helps the child walk through those emotions of loss and the sadness that comes with it and the anger that comes with it and the questions that come with it in a way that is significantly easier than dealing with the same grief when a person passes away, because it's not exactly the same. I know pets are very beloved and it's difficult, but it's still easier than when a beloved person dies. And another level would be when a grandparent passes away, hopefully when the child is much older and has a little bit more experience with grief. But even then, if it happens in a natural way, then an elderly person, we know that an elderly person is going to pass on. It's expected. It's not pleasant. It's not fun for anybody, but it's expected. And so again, this is the next level. You're dealing with grief, you're dealing with loss, you're dealing with mourning, but it's still a little bit more detached. And so that prepares them for the next level of grief that will happen one day when their own parents pass away or someone else close to them. Please, I hope you understand. I'm not trying to minimize the death of anyone or anything. It's always difficult. It's always traumatic. But I think we can all agree that the death of a pet when we are small is not exactly the same thing as the death of a parent that we have known and loved for many years. It's not exactly the same thing. And the one prepares us to be able to handle the other with greater strength and greater ability to process that grief. Back up even more, before the child experiences the death of a pet or someone farther removed from them, what if they experience it first? They experience that concept, not in any kind of physical way, but vicariously through the medium of story. What if they encounter death and grief and loss and tragedy vicariously through a story where in the end good triumphs over evil and there is a purpose in the loss and there is hope for a future beyond the loss? I think that would be step one. That's really level one. The loss of a pet, for example, the goldfish that dies. Would it be level 2 or 3 maybe? Level 1 is where we meet that tragedy in a story and those emotions, because the things are not actually happening and they're not actually happening to us, but we are seeing them happen to a fictional person in our imagination. It enables us via our imaginations to engage in these negative emotions and process them with the character as the character goes through the story and through the trial and comes out the other side. And that is a preparation ground, a practice arena for when the child or the person encounters these difficulties in the future. And I think that stories are such a powerful way to do that. Back in the Middle Ages, people did not have ready access to books. Stories were shared verbally, and Songs and rhymes and games were another way that those stories were shared. So that was the practice ground back then for children to be able to tackle these difficult subjects, but in a safe way, where they could learn how to process those emotions. Along the same lines, we look at fairy tales today and we think, oh my goodness, they told children these stories? Yes, I think so. I mean, they weren't just for children, they were for everybody. But it was a way to experience terrible things, but in a safe way, in a way where it could be, where it wasn't actually happening to you, but by engaging your imagination and taking the time to experience it briefly through another person, then you are able to experience it when reality hits sometime later down the road. So the reason this keeps coming up for me, this whole concept, is because I very, very often see parents who want to protect their children from things that would harm them, which is a natural part of parenting and is a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's a good thing. That protective instinct was put in us by God. And when I became a parent, somebody asked me, what is the thing that surprised you most about becoming a parent? And I said, the protectiveness that I feel towards my son, that mama bear instinct, it is powerful. And it engages immediately. The minute you find out that you have a baby on the way, that mama bear instinct starts and it doesn't ever go away. And it's instinctive. Like it just comes out, right? So it's a good thing. It's a God-given thing. But like all good things, it can be an extreme. An extreme one way or the other can turn it into something other than what it is supposed to be. Our mama bear instinct is on purpose to protect our children, but we can bundle them up and protect them so tightly that they never experience anything negative. We shield them from all the negative, but then they don't have the tools to handle negativity when they're in the real world on their own and their mama bear isn't there anymore. Instead of wrapping them in bubble wrap and protecting them, we instead need to discern wisely and allow them to experience in a wise, discerning way things that are negative, emotions that are negative, experiences that are negative, to help them to gain the tools that they need and the skills that they need to overcome those negative things when they encounter them in their real life. Now, then there's the opposite extreme, when children are neglected and or allowed to experience all kinds of negativity and difficulty without discernment or wisdom. That's not good either. They don't have the tools to deal with it innately. It doesn't just happen. They don't have the instinct to be able to overcome all of those things automatically. Somewhere in the middle is where we need to be guiding our children wisely through difficult things in a safe way to give them the tools to deal with it later on. And in my opinion, stories are one of the best ways to do that. And by stories, I mean books. I don't think that it's helpful or healthful for children to have a steady diet of violent movies and video games. I think that it falls on this side where they are just exposed to things without fully having the tools to work through them. And I think that a constant visual diet of violence and drama and negativity is going to desensitize them to those things rather than enable them to healthfully work through them. So I think stories that engage the mind and the imagination and aren't just, visually passing in front. Stories that engage the mind and imagination, that deal with negative emotions, that raise negative emotions, that raise a little bit of anxiety, that raise a little bit of sadness, that raise a little bit of questioning within your child. Stories that raise those negative emotions but guide them through them so that they can learn to grapple with them, learn to process them, and also give them hope for a happy ending at the end. Children should not be reading stories where everything ends horribly. In a fairy tale, things always come right at the end. Maybe not the way the character in the beginning wanted it to be, but after the trials, after the struggles, after the horrible things that happen, they live happily ever after, right? Is that realistic? No, but it gives children a hope, because when we believe in Christ, everything will end well and we will live happily ever after, which is one reason why I love the eternal perspective of fairy tales. This journey of life may be very difficult, but when we have hope in Christ beyond this life, in the end, one day, everything will end well. We will live happily ever after. We can overcome whatever life is throwing at us from this, that, and the other thing. And stories can help provide that eternal perspective of looking with hope past the trials and tragedies that come to the hope in the future. So don't be afraid. Your child may be sensitive, easily scared. Use wisdom, use discernment, but don't just avoid those things that raise anxiety and that raise sadness. But choose carefully, wisely, and purposefully. Use the power of a story to help your child get the tools they need to be able to walk through those things that make them sad, to walk through those things that make them anxious, and give them an eternal, hopeful perspective of what will be one day. So those are my deep thoughts. I totally get there's a lot of nuance to this, and I try to express that I don't think that we should just throw whatever at our kids and hope for the best. I think that we should be sensitive to different children and their different needs and different levels of capability. But I don't think that completely avoiding anything negative in their reading material is the answer. In fact, I think it's one of the greatest tools that we as parents have in preparing our children to handle the reality of life. Stories are so powerful. Utilize their power in your child's life and help them to grow and become strong and resilient people who live with courage and hope.